Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Dr. Dre, titled Compton, a Soundtrack. If it was up to me, you motherfuckers would stop coming up to me with your hands out looking up to me like you want something free. When my last CD was out, you weren't bumping me. Now that I got my own company, everybody want to come to me like it was some disease, but you won't get a crumb from me. I'm from the streets of Compton, south of downtown LA. It's an area that's become synonymous with hip-hop, past, present, and future. DJ Quick, The Game, YG, Kendrick Lamar, and, of course, N.W.A. The rap group widely hailed with the founding of gangsta rap. Hell, their first album is called Straight Outta Compton, a rap record seminal in gangsta rap, and yet bizarrely has not been one that has aged particularly well. I know it's heresy to say it, and it is a great record to be sure, but it's an example of how hip-hop was able to build on a rock-solid foundation to much greater heights. And given that hip-hop is arguably better now than it's ever been, having a downright stellar year with several excellent albums, it's almost fitting that a biopic is being released with the same title discussing the rise and fall of N.W.A. And inspired by the creation of that film, we got something special that I don't think any of us saw coming. Compton, a Soundtrack, by none other than Dr. Dre himself, heralded as his final album. And I don't think I need to stress how big of a deal this is. Dr. Dre has been touting his long-awaited Detox project that's become one of those projects that nobody really expects is gonna happen. Like that J. Cole-Kendrick collaboration album or Jay Electronica actually dropping a studio debut. And from reports, this is not Detox. And according to Dre, that's been shelved permanently because apparently it wasn't very good. But instead, something new entirely, complete with an arsenal of collaborating artists from across Dre's entire history in the industry from the Genesis to now. But after the wave of excitement cooled, holy shit, we're getting a new Dr. Dre album after 16 years. The Doctor brought us G-Funk, and one of the most forceful voices in hip-hop is back. Finally, I did have a little trepidation. Hate to say it, but having revisited The Chronic in 2001 in preparation for this album, they're both records that as a whole hold up more on vibes and personality more than they do on, wordplay, beyond a couple iconic songs. Plus, guys, it's been 16 years, and the songs he's released over the past 5 years haven't exactly made a new album from Dre all that appealing. I mean, remember I Need a Doctor? Plus, Dr. Dre's always been a more interesting producer than rapper. Even though his best bars have been ghostwritten by other MCs, which I'm giving him mostly a pass for, a full Dr. Dre project might not be as high quality as we all want it to be. In other words, my expectations were somewhat tempered going into this album. I prayed for the best, but I definitely expected the worst. 16 years after 2001, can Dre still deliver? Here's the thing. On the surface, this is exactly what you would expect from a Dr. Dre album. Propped up more on killer production and personality than hard bars and a real conceptual framework. And really, it fits in continuity with both The Chronic and 2001 and shares many of the greatest strengths of those albums. Modern but tempered in the sampling and sounds of the past. With Dr. Dre leaping on flows that can feel kinda awkward for his voice, but are compensated by his huge personality and bringing in some absolutely stellar guest appearances to the table. So much so that Dre can start to slip a bit into the background. But when you start delving into the details on this album, there's a subtle narrative and theme lurking throughout the margins of this record that doesn't just provide some of the most potent social commentary on Compton, but on Dre himself and the complicated legacy of his brand of hip-hop and the black community. In other words, while I'm not sure Compton, a Soundtrack, will have the same lasting imprint on hip-hop as some of Dre's most iconic singles, I'll make the argument that this is his most complex and mature release. That also happens to be a ton of fun and is pretty goddamn awesome because this record is great. Highly recommended. And the place we gotta start with talking about this, and there's a lot to say, with Dre himself. I've always loved his voice in hip-hop for its baritone forcefulness, but if I were to have an opening criticism of this album, it'd be that some of Dre's flows. His deeper tone just feels a little bit awkward against the staccato modern triplets like on Talk About It, or the double-time cadence or sing-rap style you can tell is a much easier fit for rappers like Kendrick or Eminem. Now, this ties into some of the vocal production, which can feel a little bit micromanaged. Not only was there a lot more auto-tune on some of the hooks than is really needed, but the inclusion of vocal fuzz to make some rappers' shouts sound more intense feels a little bit tacked on to me. It's not needed. And this flows naturally into not so much an issue, but a feature with Compton, the Soundtrack. There are so many guest appearances contributing to Dre's final album that there are points where even Dre himself can feel a bit overshadowed. As much as John Connor and Snoop Dogg just snapped on One Shot, One Kill, really it's the best Snoop Dogg has sounded in years, and the game just goes off so hard on Just Another Day, although it is a little bit dispiriting that the way that the rising Latino presence in Compton is addressed through a slur and an otherwise pretty great song, the latter track can feel a little bit peripheral. Sorry game, I like you, but it feels like the game is giving away guest spots as long as they drop quality. Now fortunately, all those guest stars did bring quality. The rapper that probably impressed me the least was King Mez, but I like his counterpoint as the non-gangsta modern rapper that Dre can actually respect, who can cut through all the bullshit. And while Justus is mostly stuck on hooks with too much auto-tune, he still sounded pretty soulful, pretty solid here. And while I've already mentioned John Connor and Snoop Dogg, the latter who only loses points for me on Satisfiction, where he criticizes commercial artists who haven't had that same level of authenticity which he has, which is a bit rich coming from Snoop Dogg considering his career longevity and success can often be linked to collaborating with those artists. The biggest improvement on this album came from Eminem. At first he seems like a bit of an outsider on this record, and that rape line near the end of his verse is definitely pushing it, not in a good way, but with better production and great intensity behind him. It reminded me a lot of his early work with Dre, and it was fantastic. Great bars there. And hook-wise, Dre actually managed to get some serious soul out of Marsha Ambrosius, BJ the Chicago Kid, and especially Jill Scott. But we gotta talk about the three guest rappers that I never expected to do well. The first being Xzibit. Yeah, his bars aren't anything all that special beyond his usual hardcore gangsta image, but my god, there's a visceral power I missed that's later echoed by Ice Cube of all people, going harder than he's probably gone in over a decade. But the big shock for me came from Cold 187M from Above the Law of all people, an often overlooked name from the genesis of gangster rap, who delivers a viscerally unstable set of bars that balances the darkness and black humor of his song shockingly well. Great work there. Of course, it helps that Dr. Dre has brought in some of his most diverse, layered, and potent production yet, trunk-rattling, explosive tracks that have so much density and fantastic balance in their composition, and you could argue Dr. Dre's production is closer to that of a film score, especially considering the musical stinger that opens up the intro that sounds like it's coming from Universal Studios, and the inclusion of symphonic strings and horns all over this album to supplement the G-funk bass lines and the howling electric guitars. That's the other thing. For as great as the grooves are with the bouncing pianos and It's All On Me, the swampy swell that transitions into the real soul of Darkside/Gone, to the desaturated keys and hi-hats for the love of the money, to the stellar DJ Premier Dr. Dre collaboration Animals that perfectly balances the bleak grit of a primo beat with Dre's G-funk, to the album closer that features the horns and the strings accents on the instantly memorable melodic groove on the closer, Talking to My Diary. What actually shocked me here the most were the times where Dre actually took some production risks. Talk about the trap-flavored explosive Talk About It with one of the hardest snare drums I've heard this year that blows all of Migos and Future and Drake's bangers combined out of the water. Yeah, the flow was kind of weird for Dre, but that production went hard as hell. Or take the squealing electric guitars or bass-heavy punch of tracks like Loose Cannons or Issues, or especially One Shot, One Kill with that revving rhythm guitar chug and great bass texture. I've heard rock songs this year that aren't this heavy or hard-hitting. Hell, I've heard some metal songs. Or take the periodic usage of trumpets. How the hell does Dr. Dre manage to incorporate interesting, jazz-inspired horn sections better than everything Donnie Trumpet and the Social Experiment did on Surf earlier this year? Of course, not all the experiments completely work for me. I get the idea behind the soaking wet oscillations that play out across deep water, but the tone of that song didn't really quite click for me as well. And I found the backing vocals on Satisfiction made the song feel a little bit overstuffed, but really, that's minor nitpicks. On an album this long, that's pretty impressive how good the production is. Now, some of you who are paying attention probably realize that I missed two important collaborators early on the list, and to talk about them, I need to talk about the themes and the content of this album. Much of it surrounding the decay of Compton and the environment that would prompt Dr. Dre to work his way to the top from the bottom. And here's the source that the drama where it really comes from in this album. Because let's face it, it's typically pretty hard to connect to a man who's described as hip-hop's first billionaire, especially when you could argue that a lot of the content that he cultivated focused on violent misogyny, which is almost completely gone from this album, and a gangsta image that could leave a lot more harm than good in the long run. This is where Kendrick Lamar comes in, who many could argue is Dr. Dre's artistic heir, the one who has had enough wisdom to take what he needs from the rap game and carve out his own lane, using the subject matter to shape his content but also transcend it. Because for as much as Dr. Dre can claim his content sprung from the horrible conditions of his environment, people like Kendrick Lamar had to grow up in a time where the Chronic in 2001 helped shape that culture, for better and for worse. And yet it's not Kendrick or even Dr. Dre who's the real emotional core of this album, at least not at first. Nope, that comes from a thin voice and initially kind of grating hanger-on called Paak, who grew up on Dr. Dre's music and has idolized a lot of the content, but not the work ethic that Dre advocates, which actually got him to the top. It's why when we get to the gangsta violence, it's played as black comedy, half with the eerie grave-digging sketch and half with Cold 187's shaky instability as he pulls that trigger, and thus, unable to really survive or make it in that harsh environment, Paak struggles to remain afloat in deep waters and drowns in toxic material before Snoop's verse heralds his rescue and the big hero moment of this album. It's the moment where that focus snaps back to Dr. Dre a few songs later, where Paak becomes the quiet agent who attacks Dr. Dr. Dre's intentions throughout his career. Why did he really make gangster rap? When many, including Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, could argue it's done more harm than good and was later co-opted by artists who used to make a buck rather than speak of the truth of the black experience. Why did he do all of it? Why did he perpetuate that harm? For the Love of the Money confronts Dr. Dre directly, and the next few songs get to the very root of Dr. Dre's passion if he had it. The art of hip-hop itself, which transcends all the money that he's got. And it kind of makes sense that he calls up Eminem on Medicine Man as the true dark foil to the black community. The guy who spat far more hateful vitriol than so many black hip-hop artists, and yet was rewarded rather than castigated. And yet, from his point of view, it is also all about the art. Except when it kind of wasn't. And Eminem making that realization that his skin tone actually helped him get to the top unfairly, that's saying something from him. And if we're looking for the core of Dr. Dre's work on Compton, a soundtrack, it's here. In the last 3 songs, Dre gets the most conscious that he's ever been in his entire career on Animals, calling up for a system that only cares to look at black people when they're rioting or fighting or spitting venom. The parallel to hip-hop here is pretty unmistakable. And yet, despite how the focus on his art, he was still targeted unfairly, even though he didn't hustle, he didn't sell drugs, which in a twisted way, his music then fed back into the system. And yet, it's on the final track that really hits home when Dr. Dre says, "I used to be a starving artist, so I would never starve an artist." For him, all that mattered for him was his work, was his art, which he almost describes as being a slave to his work ethic. As he looks back on N.W.A. and Tupac and the culture that he helped shape, talking to his diary, alone, looking back on the past and all the friends he's lost, the open question is left whether or not it was all worth it. And just like Kendrick Lamar's final question to Tupac on To Pimp a Butterfly, that's a question that's left unanswered. And knowing that Dr. Dre will never make another album after this lends the album's open ending a question to the audience, and a pretty heavy one. His future and that of Compton remaining very much unclear. So to put it another way, when Dr. Dre said he was inspired by Kendrick's To Pimp a Butterfly and later by the film adaptation of the gangster rap debut Straight Outta Compton that he produced, I did not expect we were going to get something like this, which is nothing less than the Doctor looking at his own decades of legacy that shaped the entire genre of hip-hop and not finding a clear answer if he did good or ill. It's a startlingly fully formed album that easily rises to one of the best hip-hop releases of this year and one of the most thoughtful, getting a light 9 out of 10 for me and the highest of my recommendations. It almost makes me wish that Dr. Dre would stick around and write more rap in this vein, but man alive, what a way to go, Dre. What a way to go. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums you'd like me to cover, more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.